Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered a huge outcry across the world. Many countries have introduced punitive sanctions against Russia in an effort to put a stop to the war. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made it clear that more sanctions could follow.
Machen wir uns nichts vor.
Let's not kid ourselves. Putin will not change his course overnight. But very soon, the Russian leadership will feel the high price it is paying. Already in the last week, the Russian stock market sank by more than 30%. That shows our sanctions are working, and we reserve the right to impose further sanctions. The EU, the US, Britain, and Canada quickly introduced sanctions against Russia. Russian banks are now excluded from the SWIFT payment system. Leading banks have been shut out of Western capital markets. Russian treasury bonds and bonds of some companies can no longer be traded. That makes it difficult for the Kremlin to refinance its debt. The West has frozen $85 billion worth of Russian assets and introduced travel bans. More than 500 people have been affected, including Vladimir Putin. Russia's access to computer chips, computers, and other high-tech products has been blocked. The latest sanctions sent the Russian ruble tumbling more than 30%, and the Russian central bank more than doubled its key interest rate to 20%. Some of the country's banks are expected to collapse, and analysts believe the sanctions will cripple the Russian economy for years to come. But the full effects could take months or even years.
It's been a month since the Winter Olympics opened in Beijing with fireworks, and Chinese President Xi Jinping waved proudly from the stands. Abandoned by most international leaders, Xi only had one prominent guest, Russia's Vladimir Putin, who certainly knew at the time that he would need some support from his powerful neighbor. That's because Russia depends on close ties with China, after the West distanced itself from Moscow. Russia might be optimistic. Last year, bilateral trade with China jumped 36% to a record $147 billion. It's set to reach $250 billion soon. That's 40% more than current trade volume between Russia and the EU. Currently, Russia is China's second biggest oil supplier, providing over 15% of its imports. The country also covers 5% of China's demand for natural gas. Meanwhile, trade in foodstuffs has been growing fast. In 2019, China allowed the import of soybeans from Russia. Last year, it added beef to the import list, and just last week, wheat. China is also a huge buyer of timber from Russia's Far East, with imports worth more than $4 billion last year. As for trade in the other direction, China sells machinery, mobile phones, cars, and consumer products to Russia, with exports surging by a third last year. China is also Russia's largest foreign investor, having issued at least $125 billion worth of loans for infrastructure projects that are largely tied to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Russia counts on China as its new key trade partner, but Beijing might show some hesitance, wary of trouble with its Western partners, should it run afoul of sanctions.
The assembly lines are shut down in the Russian city of Kaluga. Volkswagen Polos, Tiguans, and Skoda's Rapid are no longer being produced following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Normally, 4,000 people would be working at VW's facilities in Kaluga and Nizhny Novgorod. It's located 340 kilometers east of Moscow, and it's where VW produces Skoda-branded cars. The Volkswagen Group has also ceased all exports to Russia. Last year, subsidiary Porsche delivered 6,000 cars to Russia. VW blames the current crisis and uncertainty for the export stop. The move brings VW in line with other car makers like BMW and Mercedes-Benz. Leading U.S. car makers General Motors and Ford have also cut off exports to Russia. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, oil prices have been surging. Leading industrial nations now want to tap their oil reserves to mitigate the situation for consumers and companies. The International Energy Agency wants to release 60 million barrels of crude oil reserves. That's about 4% of all emergency reserves of 1.5 billion barrels. Meanwhile, Western oil companies continue to scale down their operations in Russia. BP, the biggest foreign investor in Russia, said it's abandoning its 20% stake in state oil company Rosneft at a cost of up to $25 billion. Also, oil giant Shell now says it's ending its cooperation with Gazprom in key oil and gas projects. Italy's Eni is joining Shell and BP. Traditionally neutral Switzerland will adopt all the sanctions that the EU has already imposed on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. Switzerland has banned 5 oligarchs close to Russian President Vladimir Putin from entering the country. Sporting sanctions against Russia have led to a run on German team Schalke soccer jerseys in the city of Gelsenkirchen. Demand for shirts of the club rose after the second division team dropped Russian state-owned energy giant Gazprom as its main sponsor. The Swedish furniture giant IKEA is also suspending its operations in Russia and Belarus, affecting nearly 15,000 employees, 17 stores, and 3 production sites in response to the war in Ukraine. IKEA is one of the largest Western employers in Russia. Home rental company Airbnb says it will offer free temporary housing for up to 100,000 refugees fleeing Ukraine. CEO Brian Chesky sent letters to leaders of Poland, Romania, Germany, and Hungary offering help to house the refugees. More than 1 million Ukrainians have entered the EU since the Russian invasion.
The closure of Russian airspace following the invasion is set to cause massive disruption to international air cargo and traffic. Cargo flights and passenger aircraft to Asia have to take different routes. Lufthansa Cargo says that flights from Central Europe to Japan, Korea, and China can take several hours longer and will carry up to 20% less freight. This will make flights and freight more expensive. Shipping is also feeling the consequences of the war and the sanctions against Russia. The world's largest container shipping company, Maersk, suspended nearly all container deliveries to and from Russia. There will be exceptions, however, for foodstuffs, medicine, and humanitarian goods. German manufacturers are worried about bottlenecks, especially in raw materials and intermediate products, and possible price increases. German car makers have around 50 suppliers and manufacturing sites in Russia and Ukraine. It's still too early to predict what impact exactly the war will have. Russia and Ukraine are amongst the largest exporters of wheat, accounting for about 1/3 of global exports. But these exports are now at risk, and this is hitting poorer countries in Africa and Latin America in particular. They're dependent upon cheap imports.
The people of war-torn Yemen are very concerned about the situation in Ukraine. Yemen's wheat reserves are expected to last only a few more months, but many, like here in the capital Sana'a, worry about rising flour prices. The Russian war against Ukraine will affect the whole world and not just us. Yemen will undoubtedly be affected. We're an importer of wheat, and most of our food supplies come from abroad. Lebanon says it has wheat reserves for just 1 more month. Its largest silos were destroyed in a massive explosion in Beirut's harbor 2 years ago. The country depends on wheat imports, with nearly 60% coming from Ukraine. The government is now looking for alternative sources. We've reached out to a number of countries, including the US, India, Canada, and Europe, that produce the soft wheat that's needed for the Arab bread styles we produce in Lebanon. Turkey depends on wheat imports from Russia. The country is in the midst of an economic crisis with runaway inflation. There have been massive protests over rising food prices. When we talk about relations with Russia, we usually think about weapons or energy. But much more significant is that Turkey is very dependent on the Russian agricultural sector, especially for wheat, barley, soybeans, sunflowers, and corn. We buy everything from Russia, even chickpeas. Many Turks fear the war will make matters worse and continue to drive up the prices of basic foodstuffs.
The sanctions against Russia and its counter-sanctions will affect many European companies. Eastern German enterprises like this specialized machinery producer, Kieselstein, are among those that will be hardest hit. The Chemnitz-based company can process steel, copper, and other wires. Such a machine costs up to €1 million. Each one is custom built for buyers. The company is a global market leader. Managing Director Jens Kieselstein doesn't know whether he can keep all 45 employees on payroll. Some top customers are in Russia. But the sanctions resulting from Russia's invasion complicate business. We're currently preparing a contract worth several million euros over the next 2 years. If the contract cannot be fulfilled according to the current terms, we will of course need or have to look for alternative customers. That will take time. It could lead to a cut in working hours, and in the worst case scenario, to layoffs. The medium-sized company is not an isolated case. In the eastern German city of Chemnitz, formerly Karl-Marx-Stadt, many companies have long-standing business ties with Russia. Christoph Neuberg, a foreign trade expert at the region's Chamber of Industry and Commerce, believes that hundreds of millions of euros in sales have already been lost here due to the sanctions following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Today, Putin's war could bring trade with many former Soviet republics, such as Georgia, to a standstill. Because Russia actually has a central distribution function. Many companies have established a subsidiary in Moscow or in other Russian regions, especially in the metals processing sector. And from there they were active in the surrounding regions. Jens Kieselstein does not believe that the latest sanctions will really hurt Russia, at least not as far as trade is concerned. We have Asian competitors there who then just bridge a gap in the market, and that would lead to cuts in our business here, so others would fill the gap. Kieselstein is certain that only the complete exclusion of Russia from international payment systems can really put pressure on the autocrat, Vladimir Putin.